is Reason Revolution. I'm your host, Justin Clark. Thank you so much for joining us this week. This week brings you another interview, and I am so excited to have her on the show. She is a mechanical engineer in training. She's also a designer and activist. Sarah Nicholson, welcome to the show.
Hi, Justin. Nice to be here.
Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
No problem. I recently heard you on the Women Without Belief podcast and was very impressed with what you had to say about some of the problems within the atheist movement. And so I wanted to have you on my show to sort of reiterate some of those for my audience, because I do think there are some issues within sort of the space of the atheist or humanist or broadly skeptical movement with some of its thought leaders. But before we get into that, I would just love to know, what is a mechanical engineer?
That's something I think we're all still trying to figure out. The technical definition is that we design and analyze anything that moves. So that includes electricity or water, fluid, gas, and then as well robotics, machines, cars, all of that. So my specialty is in thermal fluids and in manufacturing, although I'm also building a robot currently. So I kind of do a little bit of everything. We apply math and physics in actual design and in physical products and power plants, all of these kinds of stuff.
That is so cool. I think that's so super interesting because, as I was mentioning to you before we started recording, I'm a public historian by trade. I'm solidly in the humanities, and I sort of identify myself as a cheerleader for science. I sort of have the pom-poms and I go out there and so rah. But I think that's so interesting. And I know that you have a real interest in sort of environmental sustainability. So I'd love to get sort of your thoughts on sort of how we can use mechanical engineering broadly to sort of help combat climate change, because I think that's one of the really big ways in which we can do it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's mainly my motivation for taking these studies in mechanical engineering, is because I can see it as a really great way to cause massive change to the environment in a positive aspect. I work sort of in parallel with my brother, who's doing sustainable agriculture up in northern Canada. He's working on an institute there to create food sustainability, and they have a lot of lack of machine equipment for these types of farming that allow us to farm year-round without hurting the environment and to sequester carbon. So I'm really interested in developing projects with that, as well, of course, trying to figure out ways to make renewable energy economically efficient without affecting our everyday life. I think a lot of what environmentalism that gets wrong is that people think it means they have to change a lot, live in the cold, live in the dark, just to save the environment. So I'm hoping to develop systems so that we don't have to do that.
I'm so glad you brought that up. That's so interesting to me. I would just love to also get your quick thoughts on the recent news about the Trump administration signing an executive order basically doing away with some incentives for alternative energies, particularly, I think, solar and wind. What's your reaction to that?
It's hugely discouraging, although within the engineering community, I know up here in Canada and within North America, so in America as well, we have sort of an unwritten rule that we do not follow politics. So we kind of will, I have hope and faith in the engineers and in, our everyday studies, and, lots of the research that's being done is to continue to develop these programs in spite of politics or public opinion. Mm-hmm. You can see that in nuclear power plant development. It's still happening in Ontario, where I live. The majority of our power comes from a nuclear power plant or hydroelectric dams. So we're not even burning coal for the majority of our power plants. So this happens in spite of the government, but it is, from an economic point of view, that's always the baseline for decision making, no matter what our awesome science can come up with. So it's very, very discouraging. And just so backwards.
I think so too, because I'm a firm believer that one of the ways that we can sort of combat climate change is to not just find ways to make fossil fuels more energy efficient, but finding ways to wean off them in some capacities, particularly in the developed world. I think in the developing world, it's a little bit harder to do that, but in the developed world, I think we can for sure. And so I'm really inspired by the fact that there are a generation of people who are working on trying to solve these problems, because I do think that's one one of the ways we're going to do it. Let's change gears a little bit and talk a little bit about your upbringing. One thing I love to do with my guests on the show is get their origin story. So I think you have a very interesting story about how you got out of religion. So I'd love to hear. So what was your upbringing like?
Well, I was raised as a missionary kid. So what that meant, for those of you people that don't know, we were Christian evangelicals. So my parents believed that the purpose of our religion was to spread it to as many people as possible. And that led them to move to the Amazon, right in the smack in the middle of the Amazon in Brazil. And I was born there with my siblings, and we were raised there till I was about 10. So we lived in a very small community of missionaries outside of a town. And my parents were support missionaries, so they supported other missionaries who would go and visit villages, and we would teach some kids English and offer medical support and just do sort of general charity while also working to develop a Bible in all the different languages that are spoken in the Amazon and then spread that. So that was obviously quite intense and all-encompassing. I spent, when you're a missionary, you have to raise money for your livelihood by going on these sort of tours. They're a bit like a musician would, where you travel every 2 years. We were required to travel around North America, and we would put ourselves at different churches. So I spent a lot of time in front of people and a lot of time learning how to tell stories, how to manage our appearance so that we would be, considered good Christians and worthy of support. And so I grew up in that very, very strict fundamental Christianity as well, very old-fashioned, lots of gender roles, lots of modesty regulations, memorizing the Bible, memorizing the hymns, and just learning it in and out. And then we moved to Canada. The missionary work is not that sustainable in terms of keeping up with the modern world, because a lot of it is, you're living poor because the money that you earn is capped so that it's not seen as godly if you're, living too well off. So there's not a lot of educational opportunity. So my parents decided that they wanted us to learn better English and to be able to go to university in North America. So luckily, my mom already had Canadian citizenship. She was born in BC, so she lived up here. So she and my father brought us up here to a very small farming town in the middle of Ontario, which was quite a culture shock for us. While we lived in the Amazon, so right in nature all the time, we didn't have glass windows, so we were quite immersed in nature, just with the breeze and the rain coming through onto our kitchen table all the time. So we were used to the outdoorsiness, and so Canada has a lot of that to offer, which was really nice, but everything else was completely different. So it was quite a difficult transition for us. My father, who was also a missionary kid, he was born in Papua New Guinea, and that's where he was raised. He had a hard time adjusting to Canada, and that kind of, all of those cultural difficulties and economic difficulties. My parents were only trained in missionary work, and what can you do in North America if you're not a missionary with only missionary experience? So all of those difficulties kind of shook the foundations of our family, and I think that helped to wrap around the religion, because a lot of what our family was built off of was this, cement, rigid structure of religion in the Bible. And so it was a process of a couple years of tough readjustment, through which a lot of growing happened. And I think, so I was about 11, going through my preteen years, going through culture shock, learning a lot of English words that I'd never learned in a fundamental Christian school, and I think that set me in motion on a skeptical journey right away, even though I was fundamentally Christian still, and I got even further into it. It was almost like I could feel it slipping away because we weren't in the environment of religion that we had before. And so my last final clinging to it. I went to many Christian fundamental camps, and I would win prizes for being able to cite all of the books in the Bible in order, and all of the sons of Abraham by age, and all of these kinds of things. And I was always willing to give my testimony, and really, really trying to get into it to sort of keep things together. But then my parents ended up divorcing, and my mom moved across the country to BC, and she really went through her own skepticism and realized that a lot of religion had been hurting her life. She grew up very fundamental Christian as well. She actually runs the Women Beyond Belief podcast, which is the one that I was on. So she's on her own skyrocketing journey through all of this as well. So having that external push, it really shook up what I had been trying to keep together. And the church that we were a part of was a very fundamental Baptist church, all about appearances. That raised millions of dollars for the new church, in spite of the majority of the small town we lived in being addicted to drugs or on welfare, and that kind of stuff we just didn't question for a long time. But then once my mom and my dad got divorced, us kids were sort of left behind by the church. And then my father, for his own reasons, couldn't have us kids live at home anymore. So my older brother and I moved out when I was 16 years old. And we were desperate for an apartment, and just, all I knew how to make at the time was macaroni and cheese. And, we had to figure out a lot of stuff really quick. And all of a sudden, the community that we had been a part of wasn't there. And in fact, they were judging us for blaming us for being children of the world, or for being too reckless. And so it was almost like we got what we deserved as 16 and 17-year-olds. What do we really deserve at that point? But so that was the biggest pushing point for me when I was 16 and I moved out on my own and lost the support of the people who had told me that they were the ones who were supporting the world. That was the message we got a lot growing up, was that Christians were the ones with kindness and we were the ones with morals. And anyone who grew up without religion couldn't develop those morals. And they were just, murdering babies and cheating on their wives. And that's the view that I had. And then realizing, in fact, that it wasn't necessarily tied to the morals that I had or that I wanted for the world, that wasn't coming out of the religion automatically. That was really a shaking point for me. And then also, of course, when going through, our mental health were not great during all of those times, and really realizing God wasn't there. And I spent a lot, probably since I was 12 until I was 16, a lot of time doing different thought experiments within myself to try and see if I could find God. I really was meditating at this time, and I didn't even know it. But
What were some of those thought experiments, if you remember them?
Well, there was a couple of things. There was the question of trying to find who was listening. So that is a technique used in Buddhism sometimes to realize that you don't have a self, but I used it to sort of realize that there was no God, because a lot of the messages that I had was that God was always watching, always listening, always there. So since I figured I could hear my own thoughts, I tried to find anyone else who might hear them, because I figured that I could sort of feel an essence of God if there was one there. And of course, the further that you go around the corners of the mind, you realize there is no end. There really is there's no base there. So I didn't find God in my teenage looking. And then I also read part of Sam Harris's Letter to a Christian Nation book, which my brother gave me right when I was 16 at that time. So that was perfectly lined up for my angstiness, and it really catapulted me. But then interestingly, and like a lot of people do, I couldn't leave religion wholly. So I wanted to find a different one, because I had no basis for understanding life without it. I didn't even learn about evolution. I was in a public school when we moved to Canada, but I would sit through the science with sort of half my ears open, just knowing when I would go home, I would shake off whatever they were trying to tell me, because I grew up totally involved in it. So we thought, my brother and I, we went through a couple of different religious things. We thought about Judaism, and then Buddhism was sort of what we went to, because it fit a lot of that thought process that we were already doing, some of that meditation we were already doing. And so then I spent the rest of my high school and the first 2 years of my university, not fully as a practicing Buddhist, but really involved in meditation. And then I went to live in BC for a while. So I don't know if I think your West Coast is similar to ours, but there's a lot of spirituality out there that's, wrapped up in the woods and the mountains and the birds. And so I got into that. And I remember having conversations with some of my family members who are still Christian and them saying, well, God now it just means the wind, it just means these other things. So it was really easy to just sort of transfer those same belief systems just into something else that still had the same emotional response where I felt there was a purpose and there was a meaning. And so I still within my website, I'm sure you can find lingerings of this now embarrassing spirituality that I really held on to after I left Christianity, where it's very poetic. And I feel so bad to any of my friends who came to me for advice during those years, because I probably said something totally vague and unhelpful, like just follow the good vibes or something.
I had a minor Buddhist phase myself when I was in high school. A lot of times I grew up non-religious. My parents were non-religious, but most of my interest in religious stuff was primarily through music. So I was really into sitar music. I was really into Ravi Shankar and George Harrison and the Beatles and stuff like that. And through that was how I sort of got into this sort of Eastern stuff. One of my favorite Beatles songs is a song called Within You, Without You. And there's a chorus part of it that says, and in the end, you realize that you're only rather small and life goes on within you and without you. And as a 16-year-old kid, that was like profound as hell. So I was way into it. And I remember I went to the library and I got the book Becoming Enlightened by the Dalai Lama.
Yes.
And I started to read it, and I found myself very confused because a lot of it was sort of what the philosopher Daniel Dennett calls deepities. It's stuff that sounds very profound, but in reality, it's actually not profound at all. And so it was a lot of shit like the key to happiness is enlightenment. The key to enlightenment is happiness. And it was just a lot of like tautologies and circular reasoning, and which I didn't even know at the time was there, but just I didn't know those terms back then, but I sort of was like, this is kind of bullshit. And that was at that point, I sort of got halfway through the book and I was like, I don't think I'm this either. Because I couldn't handle the vagueness of it. I wanted something I could sort of touch and that was real to me. Because I've never had religious experiences. I don't know what that feels like. To me, religion has always been an intellectual pursuit. It's always been something there that I've sort of looked at as a set of ideas or beliefs and sort of how you unpack them. But I'm intrigued by hearing people's different stories. One quick follow-up question I want to do before we move on. You were talking about sort of the culture shock of going from being a missionary child in what was it, Brazil or?
Yes, Brazil.
To coming back home to Canada, to your new home in Canada, and how that was such a huge culture shock. And you talked a little bit about how language was. Could you elaborate a little more on what some of the other cultural shocks that were there for you that may have played a part in you leaving religion?
I think a big part was that in Canada, we have Bible belts similar to what it sounds like the States has.
Oh, yeah.
So we have a lot of those same ideologies floating around. And I think one of the really strange parts exhibited by the church, but also by the majority of the people in that community was, us versus them-isms. And we were not included in the us because we were sort of immigrants, and we talked a little bit funny. We all still sort of have weird pronunciations with certain words, and we showed up in the middle of winter with tans, and because we were, straight from the rainforest, and all of this sort of stuff separated us. And also, there's a lot of classism that we have in rural towns, and so the missionary class is on the lower end, but we didn't really fit in with the lower end class either, because, most of those people had lived there for 6 or 7 generations. So it was really this, you're not one of us feelings. So that was within the church even stronger than in the other locations. But I think a lot of conservatism and small town beliefs are to remain, keep your lives private and to avoid change. So nothing about those two things represents my family. We are absolutely always in the public, partly because we grew up on these missionary tours and we're used to telling our stories, forever. And also change. We moved every 2 years. I've taken probably 100 flights at least at this point, and my grandparents, who were missionaries, owned 100 houses. They bought their final 100 house a couple of years ago. So we were really, really, really used to change. And I think people who absolutely despise change are terrified of people willing for change and advocating for change because it is uncomfortable. So those two things created just a weird. People didn't really know how to react to us. So it was kind of like we were foreign, but my brother and I are both blonde. We're all white, and we do speak English. So it was. I think it was just hard to put us into a place, and so we fell into the them, and that. A lot of people, I think, in small towns who are considered them end up where I am now with much more interesting lives. Yeah, so those are the main cultural shock issues that I felt. And I still feel a love for many of the people who live in those small towns, and I'm really glad that I had that experience to fully understand nationalism, especially for Canada. I don't have a sense of nationalism since I don't even know what to call myself. I'm not really Brazilian and I'm not really Canadian. And that's, pretty ingrained in my family. We're all first generation immigrants in some way. So I'm glad that I could see that and empathize with that through those people that I lived there. And as well, it's very important for me to learn about conservatism in the current politics and in the ways that I can have discussions with people now. So
that's so interesting to me because I live in the American Midwest. I live in the state of Indiana, and I've lived here my whole life. And I grew up in sort of one of what you would deem sort of a small town. I grew up in a suburb of Indianapolis, which is the capital where I live now. And what was so interesting to me was because my parents were non-religious and we didn't go to church, and I can count on one hand the amount of times I've been to church. I grew up in this very insulated environment because I grew up around a lot of what you would sort of call your traditionally conservative Christian stuff, but I never lived with it because I never had to. I didn't really experience it until I was about 14. My mom and dad are also divorced, and when my mom and dad split up, my dad and we moved up north to a much, much smaller town to live with my grandmother, and my grandmother helped raise me. And that was a huge culture shock for me as well, because that was really the first time I had ever heard somebody like, have you been saved? And I was like, I don't know what that means. Like, what are you talking about? Like, what the hell does that mean? And I remember this very weird experience where I had a friend of mine, I was in 8th grade, and the librarian, it was after school. So this goes to show you just how creepy religion can be. It was after school, and my librarian and my friend, essentially, they saved me in the library. I was like, at the time, I was like 14, and I was already pretty politically aware, and I was already pretty liberal at that point. And I basically asked them some litmus test questions. I said, look, I'm against the Iraq War. Can I be a Christian and be against the Iraq War? Or I'm pro-choice. Can you be a Christian and be pro-choice? That one was a harder one for them to answer. I'm against the death penalty. Can I be a Christian and be against the death penalty? I didn't think they expected those kinds of questions from somebody my age, but I cared about them deeply. And so, for me, I've always viewed religion as sort of an intellectual thing and then a political thing. And I find that religion, to me, at least in the United States, the vast majority of what we see in the popular culture about Christianity is very much defined by a small subset of evangelical Christians, because they're the ones who, they have a lot of money and they have a lot of power, and they wield that power pretty significantly in our culture, especially now, even though the country's becoming more non-religious as a whole. So I know what that kind of feels like. I know what it feels like. I mean, I don't know it to the extent that you do. I think your story is way more interesting than mine. But I know it to the extent that I know what it's like to feel like you don't fit in anywhere. Because I feel like when you sort of reject a cultural norm around you, or you don't accept a cultural norm around you, and you're sort of trying to figure out your new place, society isn't always kind to you for doing that. And so I think it takes a lot of courage to sort of stand on your own 2 feet and say, yeah, I'm going to be this now, or I'm going to do this. I think that's pretty admirable. So let's change gears again. And I heard you on the Women Without Belief podcast, and I was immensely impressed by both your passion and your eloquence on some of the problems there within the atheism movement, or sort of the broader sort of atheist skeptic community. And one point of entry to talking about this is, on a recent episode of his podcast, Sam Harris had on Ben Shapiro, the conservative columnist, talk show host guy, and Eric Weinstein. And they had a pretty interestingly bothersome and frustrating conversation about the Supreme Court case here in the U.S. about the bakery that refused to make a cake for a gay couple. And here in the United States, and this is something I try to tell people, but here in the United States, we have a centuries-long tradition of something called places of public accommodation, which is even reinforced more strongly by the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And basically what that means is, if you're a place of public accommodation, so if you're a business like a restaurant or a hotel or a gas station, you can't discriminate against people based on, their sex or their gender or their sexual orientation, things like that, or particularly their color or creed or whatever. And Ben Shapiro gave this typical bullshit pablum line about, I'm a libertarian about this kind of stuff, because he talks real fast and people think that talking really fast means you're smart. And Harris, to my astonishment, basically agreed with Shapiro, and I was bothered by that. And I liked the way that a podcaster named Thomas Smith, who does a podcast called Serious Inquiries Only, he did a podcast where he said Sam Harris sides with Ben Shapiro over the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which I thought was like a really good framing of it, which is that Harris basically gave this sort of line, well, I'm sort of a libertarian about this too, and blah, 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 blah. And my first thought was like, it's pretty easy to be libertarian when you're not someone who's probably going to be discriminated against. Mm-hmm. If you're someone who's gay, or you're someone who's black, or you're someone who is another person of color, it doesn't matter. When you live in a community where people can say, oh, you can just go to another bakery, that's not that fucking easy to do that. And more importantly, the problem I have with the way they frame the discussion is it gives all these kind of liberties to the producers, but what about the consumers? Don't the consumers have a right to religious liberty too? Don't the consumers have a right to their own particular liberties to be able to go into a place of business and be served without discrimination? That's always the problem I have, is there's this sort of undue respect that's given to people who produce rather than people who consume, and I feel like they should be rather equal in this space. That's my rather lengthy preamble to get into sort of, you've been heavily critical of some things within the atheist movement, and particularly some thought leaders within the atheist movement. So I would love to just hear some of your overview about what are some of the problems that you see, and don't be afraid to name people who you think have a view that's problematic to you, or something that you think is troubling.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad you're willing to have this conversation, but I warn you, after that podcast episode on Women Beyond Belief, and I'm absolutely small potatoes, as my mom would say, but I've gotten people privately emailing me, to give me their opinions, and it's almost always in vehement defendance of Sam Harris. So I realized I've really touched a bruise there. And I think what's scary to me is that within the skeptical community, we are unwilling to be skeptical of Sam Harris. And I like to call him the atheist gods, him and, Richard Dawkins and Lawrence Krauss and all of these people who have given us some really awesome books, some really great thought points, and very interesting interviews. So I've read many of Sam Harris's books. I've done a lot of the meditation that he suggests, and I listened to every single podcast up until I followed him on Twitter. And then I started, so this awakening that I think a lot of people are having now after that Ben Shapiro interview, which, by the way, I love the podcast interview on Serious Inquirers Only. That was a really interesting one about the interview. I didn't actually listen to that one, but I listened to the critique of it, and I think I got what I needed.
You did.
Yeah, so I think that awakening, that sort of like, wait a second, what? You are falling back and you're aligning yourself with someone who's against what we assumed was your core principle, which is criticizing religion. And that's shocking. But many of us women have had that shock months ago as we've started to realize, and this is my biggest criticism because it's most strongly and emotionally affects me, the lack of correct representation, or at least fair representation, of feminism within these thought leaders in the atheist community. So a lot of the discussion, and I've paraphrased a lot of this, so these are the exaggerated versions, but a lot of the discussion that I could get from these leaders was just anything that they could say that would be knowingly against maybe what a liberal would say, but still gain them fans. So a lot of times they use, I like to call it the faux for intellectualism or academia, where they use language either by talking quickly or by using sort of repetitive terms. It's a little bit chant-like in some of the terms, postmodernism and all of these different types of terms.
Cultural Marxism.
So they use a lot of this intellectualism that we're all dying for, of course. We're cheerleaders both of science, and I am a cheerleader for humanities. We want to have these awesome conversations, and podcasting is a fantastic way to have it. But I think that their methods or their motives haven't yet been considered. I don't know if they necessarily have motives, but when it starts to get a little bit weird and funky, which it did with the Ben Shapiro episode, and with, if you look at a whole, with Sam Harris's treatment of feminism, then you start to wonder, is this the best representation of reason that we have? And are they preventing me from finding more reason? So that was a lot of what I felt anger about, especially that I was very angry that podcast interview. I just was sitting at my table and ranting to my mom, and she recorded it. But I was quite angry that it wasn't a neutral effect on the skeptical conversations and on the skeptical community, because I was feeling in myself, and I was listening to Sam Harris, Josh Zepps, which I still find quite interesting, but I don't know, I was listening to Joe Rogan, and then that led me into, because of the people that they interview frequently and repeatedly, that led me into people like Brett Weinstein?
Brett Weinstein,
Jordan Peterson, Gad Saad, and then Stefan Molyneux. And, I say him at the end because he's kind of what I consider the extreme end of what the circle that these skeptical leaders have drawn around themselves. And the reason that those people are within their circle is because they share a similar willingness to criticize something that either people are fighting for currently or that liberals tend to encourage, right? And it's very exciting to say something politely. So Sam Harris does speak very politely. It's exciting to hear someone say something politely that goes against what we're all trying to do. And I think right now, a lot of us are trying to figure out things like sexuality, right? So we're trying to articulate it, and it's totally a developing conversation. We're absolutely still figuring this out, even myself. And then in this conversation, those that gain the fame most frequently are those that challenge those trying to have the conversation, because that lets people stay where they are, the status quo warriors. It's so much more comfortable to hear an intellectual take that allows me to not change. It's really fantastic. I love the feeling. I remember feeling, oh, good, they criticize gender pronouns. Now I don't have to worry about thinking that through. And yet now I'm realizing that I don't think that's the most intellectual take. And I think what it's just doing is reinforcing sort of the anti-emotional intellectualism that is withheld as gospel truth in a lot of these skeptical communities. And so whenever you use emotional language, which has to be used in a lot of these discussions, then the framing and the way that we react to that is shaped by Sam Harris and Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson and Brett Weinstein. And that's where I want them to be either more open to talk about that, or for us as listeners to understand that they're not going to be the sources of our emotional intelligence, and we have to outgrow them. I'm not at all, wanting to smear these leaders, and I still find, of course, the work that they're doing, they're having discussion about ex-Muslims that a lot of people are not willing to have. And I think that's a tough one that they obviously receive a lot of hate for, but that's sort of their liberal agenda. That's how they're fighting for equality. But then on the other progressive issues, they're lacking there. And I think using libertarianism, you described it really well, where you sort of described the privilege of, to be a libertarian, you have to not rely on the systems of government or the systems of support that a lot of us rely on. So that was really well articulated, and now I'm going to use that, with my family members.
Well, thank you. I mean, the other big thing about it too, and this is no surprise coming from an historian, I find with a lot of libertarians, because I was a libertarian. When I was in college, I had a libertarian period where I was a pretty hardcore objectivist. I was a follower of Ayn Rand. And you called them the atheist gods, which I really liked, because the way I would articulate it, I guess my spin on that is that I would call it the cult of reason, which is funny because my show's called Reason Revolution, so you'd think maybe I'd like that. But the problem I have with sort of the guys in that space of what I call the cult of reason is that they can sort of get away with saying the most ridiculous or outlandish bullshit under the guise of, well, I'm just being reasonable. I'm just being rational. And with Sam Harris, he gets away with it a lot because he is so calm. But I find it interesting to me that he is so surprised that a huge section of his fan base are Trump supporters. I find that interesting because sometimes if you actually take his positions on things, whether it's profiling or torture or the nuclear first strike or things like that, if you actually take them to their logical conclusion, they're actually fairly conservative positions. And so, and particularly when he talks about things like, when he says things like the left is irredeemable at this point. And my thought is, well, I am on the left. And I'm not I'm not the caricature that, you're making me out to be. And that sort of alienates me as a listener because are you on the right then? And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but sort of be more open about it. My big break, the person who broke me on this kind of issue was Dave Rubin. I used to be a big Dave Rubin fan, and I have just completely done a 180 on him. I think he's a complete fucking moron. And I am bothered by the fact that he has absolutely insane people on his show who say absolutely horrible things and doesn't challenge them on them. So like when he had David Horowitz on, and Horowitz basically called Obama a terrorist, and Dave just kind of sat there and nodded like a fucking idiot. Or when he has somebody like Stefan Molyneux on, who talks about sort of the odious stuff about race and IQ and shit like that. Again, no criticism, no challenging, no actual back and forth. Or when he has like really shitty people who should not deserve a platform. People like Weird Mike Cernovich, who's the guy who sort of profligated the Pizzagate conspiracy that led to a man basically opening gunfire on a pizza place because he thought that it was running an illegal pedophile ring by Hillary Clinton. Mm-hmm. I mean, he gives these guys this kind of platform, and I'm all for free speech. I get it. I understand that. But at some point, you have to have a certain level of like discretion and integrity to say that person isn't worth listening to because they're completely nuts, and just have like a clear distinction. And so I'm always bothered sometimes when, I see Sam Harris say, oh yeah, Dave Rubin got that right or whatever. And I'm just like, but Dave Rubin is the living embodiment of an opportunist. He was a guy who failed at the Young Turks, shifted to the right, doesn't claim that he's of the right, but shifted to the right because the Patreon money was good. And the thing, too, is that he used to be a very public and vocal atheist, and he's backpedaled on that because the vast majority of the people who give him money every month on Patreon are conservative Christians. So, of course, he's going to walk that back a little bit. That also happens when you spend more time with crazy-ass Dennis Prager. But this is really my problem, is that there's this like weird component to the atheist skeptic movement on the whole that is comfortable with very strange bedfellows. Like, to me, like the idea that atheists or people who are secular would like people or sort of generally agree with people like Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson is very strange to me.
Well, I think a lot of it has to deal with how we are told about offense. How we talk about offense. So a lot of the discussion is given to you that if you are offended or if you are being emotional, then you're an SJW, you're likely being irrational, and you're making a fool out of yourself, right? That's the most common response I will get on anything on Twitter or in any even real life conversations is, oh, are you offended? So when we get offended by the crazy things these people say, we ignore it because being offended has been painted to mean that we are not being rational. And I think this has actually had the opposite effect, where we keep people who are offensive around more commonly, and the goals of the free speech seem to just be to give a microphone to trash. It's not necessarily let's have some awesome writers that we maybe wouldn't have heard of because they're a minority or they're in poverty or something. Let's give them books, right? That's freedom of speech. That's supporting it. Instead, it's let's all make a bunch of money as a bunch of white dudes and just keep talking about the same stuff over and over again. And I think what I find really frustrating is the lack of academic references from people who consider themselves academic too. I think podcasting as a form, it's difficult to fit in our footnotes, of course. You're not going to list off a big bibliography at the end, but a lot of the claims that are being made by any of these people on the show being interviewed or the interviewees or the interviewers are not being referenced. And so a lot of these political opinions, either they neglect history. So for example, we'll throw fascism around. And I'm like, well, what are you meaning by that? Or any of these sort of like, cultural Marxism. Well, what do you mean by that? Which philosopher are you referencing when you're describing this? Which period of history are you referencing when you say that, the liberals are taking us back to communism or socialism or whatever it is? And I think they get away with a lot. And so I'm excited to hear that you're not letting them get away with it so much. And I think Dave Rubin is a really good... I love him for the memes of him just looking sad. There was that one time where I think it was Blair White.
Oh, yeah. And Red Pill Black.
Yes. And then the song played over him just looking sad. And I can laugh at that, but I also feel intense anger for the responsibility that he has to society. So a lot of criticism that I've gotten for criticizing Sam Harris is that his listeners have their own sense of agency. And this is something Sam Harris will say as well on his podcast, is I'm not responsible for all of the Trump supporters or the white supremacists in my audience. I'm not responsible for what my interview, like the people I interview, do or say outside of my interview. I'm not responsible for that. But my response is that Sam Harris, as advertised in his podcast and in his work of writing and in academia, he is a cultural influencer criticizer. So he criticizes what influences culture, and he tends to criticize the more progressive things that are trying to influence culture. But I would say that Sam Harris is a cultural influencer. Sam Harris has given voice to Jordan Peterson, who is a huge cultural influencer, and his effects are likely to be more harmful than good in some ways. So that's where I criticize Sam Harris, and that's where I think his responsibility for his audience is. Like, he has to say that he is influencing culture when he hears. I mean, he must go on the street and hear. Any young guy probably has heard of Sam Harris. Like even the term SJW. I didn't learn that before his podcast, and we have a sense of agency, of course, but as a young person, many of my friends, all of us in university, we are looking up to people of authority. And as someone who has millions of followers and listeners and downloads, that's definitely considered an authority. He remains, as the presidents come and go, he still remains with his commentary available for all of us to listen to. And I can use my agency to listen to him or not. And that's where I think the responsibility is, even though, I mean, I'm sure he will still say this is unfair to his true goals.
Yeah, I mean, for me anyway, I think one of the main criticisms that I have of Harris, and I say this as a fan, I mean, I say this as somebody who, I did my episode last week on some of my favorite books in atheism and humanism, and The Moral Landscape was in my top 10. I love that book. I think it's his best book. I think it's his most clearly thought out book of all the books that he's written. And it's no surprise because it's basically an expanded and popularized version of his PhD dissertation. So I'm not surprised that it's the one that's the most rigorous. My big problem with sometimes with Harris, and it's actually a bigger problem I have with Dave Rubin, for guys who talk a lot about politics, they're very apolitical.
Yes.
And what I mean by that is that Dave Rubin genuinely does not understand either the beliefs that he holds or the implications of them. He doesn't, I'm sorry, I know this probably sounds mean, but I genuinely don't think Dave Rubin is smart enough to get that. But for me, my big issue is that whenever they have somebody on a show, like a great example is there was that clip that went around a couple years ago where the conservative talk radio host Larry Elder was on his show. And Dave Rubin was talking about, well, there are still problems of systemic racism in our culture. And Larry Elder, who has sort of a Ben Shapiro thing where he likes to talk very fast and talk over people. And Larry Elder's like, is that really the case? Because look at this percentage, look at this data, look at this data, and look at this data. And you were talking earlier about citing sources. Not at one point does Larry Elder actually really cite the sources for the claims that he makes about the data in the episode. I'm not necessarily saying he's wrong. He just doesn't cite his sources. And instead of Dave Rubin taking the fucking time to actually sit and do the fucking homework and learn about his guest and learn about the positions of his guest and come prepared to actually have a conversation, he just sort of sits there like a moron. And people sort of praise this moment of, oh, Dave fucking took the fucking red pill. He fucking saw the light about this kind of shit. No, what that was a conservative commentator talking over an idiot. That's really kind of what it was. And I'm hard on Rubin because he's somebody I used to really like, but I've seen him just descend into madness, particularly when it comes to Trump. When Trump was elected, he does this video where he says, I'm going to hold Trump's feet to the fire, and then proceeds to not do any of that ever. Because, again, the people who fund him, the people who give him the checks are Trump people. Or if they're not Trump people, they don't explicitly hate Trump. Or they're not people on the left, or they're not resistance people, right? And he talks all the time about how he wants to have a marketplace of ideas, but then genuinely doesn't have liberals on his show. So, for example, Sam Cedar, who does the Majority Report, I like him a lot. He's wanted to get on his show forever, but Dave Rubin won't have him on the show because one of his producers called him a moron. And I'm sorry, but like, here's the thing, Dave. If you like free speech so much, then take the fucking hit. People call you an idiot. Why don't you show them that you're not an idiot instead of being a bitch and sort of unfollowing them or blocking them? He doesn't take criticism very well at all, which is, I think, another huge problem. In terms with Harris, there are two particular things he does that I don't like when he thinks out an issue. And I've named them. And this is the first time I've talked about them on this podcast. One of them I call the Harris hyperbole, and the other one I call the Harris two-step. The Harris hyperbole is where Harris will basically create the most extreme, ridiculous thought experiment about a particular position in order to make what his position is, which out of the context of the crazy thought experiment he set up is actually pretty outlandish in and of itself, look more reasonable. He does this when he's talking about like torture, or we're talking about profiling, or talking about the nuclear first strike. The other thing he does is what I call the Harris two-step, where he essentially makes what I call a non-point, where he'll say something like, X is true, comma, but Y may also be the case. Now, maybe that's not a true dichotomy or not, but you've essentially set up a position where you're not actually saying anything. The content is null, even though the words say things. So the big problem that I'm seeing, and the reason I'm sort of talking about this, is that I say this as a fan of Sam Harris. I find that there's a lack of genuine criticism about some of these people. And I'm thrilled that people like you and Thomas Smith and others are genuinely trying to make a point of saying, like, hey, these people are worth criticizing. Sometimes they get it wrong. And just because we may be emotional about the way in which they're wrong, that doesn't make them right. And that's the thing I always try to stress back at.
Yeah, I think those are some really awesome terms, and I hope they will start, trending as we can, because there always helps with this. I think right now what it is it's a huge mass pile of words from these guys. They have ages and ages of writing and podcasting and interviews, and that has been uncriticized right up until now. We're right at the brink of this, and finding your way through Sam Harris's very thoughtful tone and speech pattern in order to figure out what it is that's actually going on is very tough. And I love the Harris hyperbole. That's the main thing that I always find. He'll start a thought experiment that couldn't ever practically exist. So a lot of this will be, let's imagine there isn't any society. Well, then by the end of it, society would be the way that it is, and it's like, well, what? It's some of my criticism. My roommate in university was a philosophy major, and I read most of his papers. And some of my criticism was always like, okay, well, so what? Yes, it's very, very interesting to be able to think about things in abstract senses and to have thought experiments. But if at the end it ends up with you having either morals that cause suffering. So there was a really interesting podcast Sam Harris did. I can't remember the philosopher's name, but it was something about, a thought experiment, like if you had $1 million painting in the house and a child, would you save the child or the $1 million painting? Because the painting's worth, but you don't yet know the child's worth. And it was sort of, the point of the podcast was sort of like, save the painting. And I remember I was cutting the grass in the summer while I was listening to this, and it was really hot. There were spiders that kept falling on me, and I was so irritated from the podcast and from the spiders. And because I was having such an emotional reaction, I assumed I didn't get it. That was my conclusion after listening to that episode. I was so still wrapped up in it. After listening to it, I was feeling irritated and mad and like, wait, I don't think that was treated fairly. But because of those feelings, I had Sam Harris's voice in my head saying, you just don't understand philosophy, or you are wrapped up in your empathy. There was that interview with the author of Against Empathy. I think it might have been on Joe Rogan's podcast. And I was listening to that one as well. And that took years for me to again think, no, empathy is useful. So these discussions, not only do they not say much, or they are not taking into account current events, current sociology, current history, or the context, the larger context of emotionality and relationships to each other, but they also give you responses in case of your reaction. That's what I find really makes me feel duped, is that a lot of my reaction, I reacted in a way that Sam Harris how I thought Sam Harris was telling me to react. And I cringed as my mom became more feminist and angry. And I pulled away from a lot of these progressive issues when I wish I hadn't of. And of course, I still subscribe to Sam Harris, and I still I really like the Waking Up book. I thought that was interesting. It kind of falls through at the end, but it was an interesting, kind of just a fun mental exercise. And I see that's his use to me. I consider him fondly, but I don't hold him as the source of any of my morality or even my thought experiments, even my philosophy. I'm realizing that there's a lot of the main thing I've learned from philosophy is that anything that I've thought of, someone else has already thought of, and they've called it some ism. So a lot of those things I want to explore. I want to figure out what are the female voices of philosophy throughout history, and also what are the philosophers who were taking into account this social effect on reality. I listened to your interview with J.R. Becker, and I thought that was a very interesting discussion about determinism and sort of broadening philosophy. And I think that is also what I want to be applied academically, intellectually, because I think these are all linked. And as you start to broaden that, I really think we're going to start to include more women and people of color naturally, because you're going to be craving these emotional issues. And a lot of this poetry is just emotional philosophy, I think. Mm-hmm. A lot of that is already happening, and it's very interesting. And that's going to, as in a libertarian argument, that's going to pull the market. I think that's where our evolution is going. I see my own mental evolution from fundamental religion to Buddhism to atheism, to anti-SJW atheism, and now to more liberalism. I see that kind of as a microcosm of a lot of what might happen, just because it came so naturally to me. Mm-hmm. The more you start to think, the more you start to care. And when you open yourself up to caring, you automatically want to be liberal. That seems to go hand in hand.
And for me, one of the things that is, I love your framing about emotions, because I think they're incredibly important too. I mean, they are a part of who we are. And oftentimes I think that the emotions we feel are a direct result of our reasoning. We think about something, we contemplate a concept that we've heard or we've read, and either we're overjoyed because it makes sense and it's consistent and it's in keeping with what we think is valuable, or it repulses you and it frustrates you and it makes you angry. That's a legitimate way to feel. Like, it's not. And so because I care deeply about that sort of intersection of emotions and reason, because I'm, even though my show is called Reason Revolution, and I value reason and I value the importance of reason in our discussions, that doesn't make me sort of like a robot. I definitely care about emotions. I'm a very passionate guy in real life. So it's not that, I think they go hand in hand. In terms of how I feel about these whole things in general, my main thing is that, and I try to stress to people, is these people they're not gods, as you say. There's nothing monolithic about them. They are open for criticism. They're imperfect. And, Sam Harris has in the past described what he does as thinking aloud in public. And I think that's great. Having said that, sometimes the thoughts you have are either wrong or they're just wildly ridiculous and they're worthy of criticism. And I say that as a guy who's a fan and is actually going to see him and Lawrence Krauss in 2 weeks in Chicago. So it's like, I say this as somebody who listens to his show and likes a lot of what he has to say and values a lot of what he has to say. But I do think there are times, whether it's him discussing something like the left broadly, whatever that sort of means. These days, whenever I hear him or some other people talk about the left, I always imagine it with like the left, where the L is capitalized and there's like a trademark after it. Mm-hmm. And the trademark, of course, is owned by the Koch brothers, where it's like the left. And I used to talk in that kind of language, right? It's very talking point, short and snappy sound bites that make sense to people. And people go, oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But then when you actually spend time and think about them, you go, well, that doesn't quite add up, or that's not quite the position, or that's a little bit of a straw man. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of my issues, that people are not above criticism. And that's the whole point of like free speech, right? Like, these people talk all the time, which they love free speech and free expression. That's the point of having it, is to criticize people when they get things wrong. So let's change gears again. You were talking a lot about feminism and social justice and things like that. At this stage in your sort of journey and your intellectual ideas, what is feminism for you, and how do you think that people like Sam Harris or people like Dave Rubin mischaracterize feminism in sort of the public space?
Yeah, I think this is the most interesting part of politics, certainly right now. And it's weird to call it politics, I guess, because feminism seems sort of like it should be nonpartisan and it should be, across all cultures and all religion, because women are in everything. And I I pushed feminism away for a very, very long time. If I had of maybe not moved to the city or something, you probably could have found me on YouTube being one of those women who are willing to say, we don't need feminism, and gain a lot of attention for that. Because I felt like, well, the only representation that I got of it from these podcasts was really lots of anger, lots of screaming, and I didn't want to have to dye my hair blue. I thought that was the legitimacy of all of it. And as I've gotten into feminism, I found such a broad range of women having really nuanced opinions about all of this. I was lucky enough to interview Sarah Hayter. I'm not sure if you know,
Sarah's terrific.
Yeah, so I interviewed her on my mom's podcast, Women Beyond Belief, and she was offering such a nuanced view of feminism as well, and from a different cultural point of view and from a different religious point of view. And we found a lot of common ground. So I think what's actually happening is this underground rational discussion, and it's so interesting. And I think it applies to everyone. Feminism for me has started to mean what I hope for in the world and for society. I think because it starts with the femme, a lot of people think it is mainly just about women, but I like to remind them that women ends in men, so you can deal with the f, like that suffix it's not exclusive. So for feminism, for me, I spend a lot of time around men, primarily around men. In my classes, there's, maybe 2 or 3 other girls out of 100 people. So the majority of my life is with men. So a lot of men's issues has been how my feminism has developed. And so what I focus on in feminism is trying to allow men to be more emotional and to have enough security in society to be vulnerable and to not have to be the breadwinners. I love the idea of my boyfriend, when we have kids, taking a maternity leave. I just think all of these kinds of things should be allowed to men. They should get to have bath bombs and face masks and do whatever they want. So that's a really soft entry point to feminism that I got to. It wasn't the anger and the yelling. It was more like, I want you guys to have fun, and I want you not to feel this pressure to have to, if somebody's getting mugged, you have to beat them off, even if you weigh the same as me. I don't want them to feel all this sense of pressure to perform academically, physically, to be leaders, to be powerful, all of that. But then at the same time, as I've gotten older and started to free myself from where I was holding myself back, because I also wanted to be seen as a not feminist woman, to be seen as just being open and loving and polite and not expressing my anger. I've started to realize that I am quite angry as a feminist as well, and that is in no way affecting the logicality, if that's a word, the logic of my opinions. So I've started to push back against the sort of the fundamental sexism within my circles, so within mechanical engineering, and that's a humongous burden. I have endless work to do there, and I've started the process to work with one of my professors and hopefully develop sort of more of an exploration into how we can include the differences, the biological differences between men and women in a non-sexist way. Because, as we've heard from James Damore and the Google Manifesto and a lot of these evolutionary biologists, they sound very sexist. And I think what's happening is the science is being used in a non-emotionally intelligent way, and also just with the wrong intentions. So I don't, of course, all science is valid. So I want to include that, because as mechanical engineers, we have to design a lot of stuff that requires physical exertion or dimensions, right? So being able to reach or weighing a certain amount in order to use the product. So how do I taught a course on this very topic. How do I talk to my students about women who have different capabilities without them considering women to be less capable? And how do we identify that? And how do we know the capabilities of others when we consider people with disabilities. So it's really started within mechanical engineering, and it's broadened. And I used to hate the word intersectionality, but now I'm realizing that I just hated it because I didn't want to understand other people other than me. So feminism is really widening up for me now, and it's starting to include all of the social justice issues that matter to me. And I see a lot of it that I do not understand yet. So I grew up quite sheltered within the Amazon and within the farming communities. So there's a lot of other cultural issues that I don't know a lot about. I grew up primarily around people of color in Brazil, but I still don't understand people of color in North America's experience and what I can do to support them. So feminism is getting it wrong. I say some stuff sometimes, and I write long blog posts, and then I go back and I think, I was just being a dick. I just didn't want to change my opinion. So I came up with this 2,000 word essay about why I shouldn't change my opinion and everyone else was wrong, when really I just needed to listen more.
Yeah. My wife has been a very strong influence on me in terms of this position. My wife and I we've been together now, married, we've been together about a year and a half, but my wife and I have been together over 11 years. And my wife always identified as a feminist. And I remember us having discussions about feminism early on. And my wife is so cool in the sense that she's a lot like me. We hold a lot of this. I always describe it this way. We have the same destination, but we get there with different roads. So, she's an atheist like me. She identifies as a feminist as I do. She's a very smart woman, but she's very practical. I sort of do this thing where okay, I need to read this thing and I'll read this position. Now, okay, now what are the normative implications of that? And I do this kind of thought shit. And Kaylee, my wife, she's just kind of like, hey, guys, don't be dicks. And hey, women should be paid the same as dudes. She's very blunt about it, but there's a profundity to that I think is important. The other thing that was very influential on me was when I started doing my research on my master's thesis. I wrote my master's thesis on the late, great free thought orator, Robert Ingersoll, who was very popular in the late 19th century. He was known as the Great Agnostic. He used to give speeches all across the United States to sold out crowds, thousands of people criticizing religion and defending what we would today sort of call humanism. He would have identified as a feminist. He was friends with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the suffrage hero. And his wife was a very forward-thinking woman who actually was non-religious before he was and sort of came from a non-religious family. And so if you read a book like Susan Jacoby's Freethinkers, which is a history of American secularism, you learn that there's a huge component to American sort of atheism or free thought in general that has a huge feminist component to it. And whether it's people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton or even Susan B. Anthony to a lesser extent. And in fact, what's interesting about Stanton was that she was later alienated from the women's suffrage movement because she took very firm positions being against religion. She sort of saw religion as being patriarchal and sort of holding women down in the culture and things like that. And in order to become more palatable to the public, they sort of distanced themselves from her, even though she was sort of a founder of the movement. And then, of course, there are other people of the period who are amazing, like a woman like Helen Gardner, who was a science communicator in the late 19th century. And then, of course, like the anarchist philosopher Emma Goldman. So there's this whole generation of leaders who today would probably be described as what you would call SJWs, but they didn't see themselves as that at all. They sort of saw themselves as freedom fighters. They saw themselves as people advocating for basically what we would now today call humanism or feminism. And so learning about them really influenced me and went, oh yeah, like this is people like to frame feminism as a very modern thing. And in some ways it is, but in other ways I think it's about as old as time, and in America it has a very rich tradition. So I had a discussion this a couple years ago with a friend of mine who is a woman. And she said, I don't identify as a feminist. I identify as an equalist. And I was like, okay, well, what does that mean? And she said, well, I think that women should be equal to men. And I said, okay, that's pretty much what feminism is. Broadly. So what is it about the feminism label that bothers you so much? And she said, well, and she kind of cited the things you said, I didn't want to dye my hair blue and scream. And I kind of reminded her, I'm like, look, I don't have blue hair. I don't scream. I'm also a dude, and I do identify as a feminist, so don't worry about it. I guess my next question for you is: are there ever times where maybe people like Harris get it right? Are there times where that the social justice crowd or people who are the ways in which they frame the discussion in the public? Are there ever ways where they're not their best promoters, they're not their best communicators? Do you think there are times where they ever make mistakes?
With regards to feminism, I think on the whole, the main thing that's been getting wrong is that women can't tell the difference between rape and sexual assault. So that's the most common thing right now, that people keep writing these think pieces about how, we got to differentiate between them. And I'm like, yeah, we are doing that. It's the same process of saying you're an equalist or something. That's built into the definition of feminism. So a lot of it that they're saying is feminism. And that's what's very funny about it. They'll bring up, what about the inequality of men in prison or of men with custody rights? And we say, yeah, we're working on that. That's what, you look at the Scandinavian countries who are way more feminist than we are, and they have a lot more equality for men in custody battles and in places where men are usually discriminated against. So it goes, a lot of what they're saying is what feminists are doing. And when it comes to the blue hair screaming, I go to school at quite a progressive university that I think we canceled Jordan Peterson's talk, and there's lots of protests. There's lots of screaming. That part is happening, but I think what they're getting wrong is that is the majority of people who hold these views. And I think also what we're getting wrong is that those people are automatically uninteresting. So there's quite a few abortion protesters at our university. They're there weekly, and we have awful weather in Canada, so I don't know how devoted they are, but they come all the time. And the first time that they came, it was a couple years ago. I was walking with my boyfriend there's a public street, and they were all set up there. And so immediately the people who are pro-choice came out to counter the protest and to have a discussion. We were all shocked that it was there because, of course, they use very graphic imagery. And there was one gender non-binary person there who runs the student union, and they were quite upset by this. So they opened up a safe space it was a shipping container where, just so happened, totally coincidental, there was a lady putting on a sexual violence art show in the shipping container. And right outside of that, these people set up with their anti-abortion posters. So it was really kind of all in your face right at one time, all of these big topics, all these big issues. And so they had a safe space in there if any of the imagery was causing you distress. And there was maybe one or two people in there who were crying, and then we're all sort of supporting each other. The art was great. But then all that's happening on the outside in these protests is discussion. It's happening everywhere. And it's heated discussion, of course, because it's a very heated issue. These issues are incredibly emotional. So, and also you think about the personal experience so many people have with these issues. I think it's something like 1 in 3 women are sexually assaulted on campus. So, of course, a lot of us are very emotional when any of these topics come up, and that is going to come out, and that, you can film that, you can put that on YouTube, and it's going to look very emotional. But I think what they're getting wrong is that we're not having discussions, in-depth discussions. So that day, me and my boyfriend stayed to sort of observe. We wanted to really just see what different people were saying, what the different arguments are. I understood a lot of the anti-abortion arguments because I was raised fundamental Christian. So I knew a lot of the typical phrases that they were going to say. But what was interesting was that it was men and women and people of color arguing both sides, and people who looked, people with blue hair arguing both sides. And I think what they're getting wrong is that a lot of people are actually having very in-depth, interesting conversations and trying to make headway with this. So I think the freedom of speech, the right way to approach freedom of speech is not to sort of laugh at the screaming, but to try and say, wait a second, are these kids with these protests trying to figure out their politics in a really interesting way? And partially, I also realized that every generation, all of us, there's hipsters every 20 years, it always comes out, and a lot of what we're saying, it's very reactionary, and we're likely not going to feel the same way. I remember when I was 18, I wrote a very libertarian, why we don't need money or government, sort of long, angry blog that actually got my entire blog flagged and taken down, and I felt really like I was fighting the good fight because I was meeting opposition and stuff, and then it took maybe just a year of reading different books, and I could say, oh, wait a second, that was quite silly, but I think what matters to me, and this is also what matters to me in feminism, is that we always maintain this probability of capability when we interact with people. I really want to assume that people who are very, very, very emotionally advocating for gender neutral pronouns have the capability to really articulate their opinions well, and that is completely rational, and that I could be convinced by that, and that me being convinced by that is a sign of that being a really great idea in the marketplace of ideas. So I think that's where they get it wrong. A lot of it is framed either that once you have blue hair and scream, you'll always be that way, or once you're a feminist, you're lost to these woeful circles of I don't know. I mean, it's assumed that we're not having these discussions about nuance, whereas where we are, there's in-group fighting all the time where we're trying to figure out what are these boundaries? How do we articulate this? What is the best way to maintain our freedoms while also establishing further establishing what hurts us? That is a very hard conversation to have. And I'm excited that it's happening. And what I'm seeing more and more is that I kind of can there's a lot of hatred towards feminists, but you can kind of leave it and you fall back into arms of support. These conversations are happening. I go to women in tech support groups where I wouldn't really call it a support group. It's called a workshop for how we're supposed to deal with the bro culture. So it's giving us really good business strategies, interpersonal strategies. I love the book Crucial Conversations. We're learning how to have these rational discussions and how to digest our own emotions when sexual harassment or just general sexism happens. We're having really, really thoughtful conversations about, okay, a guy said that and it sucked. What should we do? How do we best honor his opinions and his intentions and the place that he came from, while also maintaining our own integrity and also maintaining our own work ethic and our own comfort in order to be able to succeed within this capitalist society. So I think that's what they're really getting wrong. That the proportions and the capability of these people to change and to be nuanced in spite of emotion.
I pretty much agree. I mean, there are 2 points I wanted to sort of, highlight that I think you've nailed. One of them is that the people who are on college campuses, particularly the things we see here in the States and I know some in Canada, is that some of these kids, the reason that they're at the colleges that they are is because they are some of the most lucky people alive. They're very, very well educated. They're likely, if not from a wealthy background, they're solidly middle class, and if not middle class, then they've certainly hit the upper echelon of sort of meritocracy, if you will, and that they're sort of using that as a means by which to sort of investigate where they fit in the world. That's the one thing I think people need to keep in mind is a lot of the people that people like Dave Rubin make fun of, a lot of them are 18 to 22. They're young, man. I remember being that young. I remember being that I'm 27 now. I remember being a few years younger like that and being the angry, pissed off, objectivist guy who would write these tracts online and shit like that, like you did. I brought this anti-union, anti-minimum wage economist from Canada to the school I went at. I ran a student group for libertarians and shit like that. So they're young, right? They're full of a lot of them are just sort of full of optimism or just passion, because that's what it's like to be young. It reminds me of that song I Was a Teenage Anarchist by Against Me, where the chorus is, do you remember when you were young and you wanted to set the world on fire? There's a relevance there, right? And the other thing I guess I wanted to point out is that there's a fundamental thing about the way in which sometimes I think people like Sam Harris, and especially people like Dave Rubin do this, is they hit on this thing of like, oh, these kids just don't want to have conversations. All these kids just don't want to debate. All these kids don't want to like a marketplace of ideas, blah, 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 blah. They're triggered snowflake, whatever. Insert lame ass talking point here. And what you've highlighted is the fact that a lot of people are actually having these conversations, and they're having, I think, very interesting and crucial and very complex conversations about ethical concerns in our society, whether it's, issues of sexual mores or issues of equity or issues of intersectionality. We're having those conversations. Just because you may not necessarily like the conclusions that we may be drawing from those conversations doesn't mean we're not having them. And so I find it funny that sometimes the people who talk all the time about how we are defending freedom of expression, we are defending the marketplace of ideas, almost in the same breath do this like sort of straw man caricature of some of what they would sort of deem SJWs. I find it to be sort of hypocritical, and it shows a real lack of genuinely actually taking the time to actually like talk to people who are a part of the people you're criticizing. They talk all the time about the left is like this and SJWs are like this. And my thinking is, why don't you actually talk to one of them? Why don't you actually have a conversation with one of them, and maybe you'll come out of that conversation less like you don't have the blinders on. It just seems to me like, and I say this as somebody who doesn't necessarily identify as an SJW. I just identify as a liberal. Like, that's what I am. I'm a liberal. I'm a liberal guy. I have liberal views. And there's a lot about progressivism that I agree with. But because we get so obsessed with these labels and these talking points and these cliches, that we're using those as a substitute for an actual conversation. And that's where I'm very concerned, because for people who love to talk all the time about how reasonable they are, they're not being that reasonable about this.
Yeah, and I think they're not being that brave either. I mean, where is the debate between Sam Harris and a rational feminist? Where is that discussion? Someone on Twitter pointed out 4 episodes where Sam Harris had interviewed a lady, and I said, that's not the same thing. It's not, you don't just interview a lady and that's talking about feminism. You actually have to debate the ideas and the methods that fix it. That's the other thing, is a lot of Sam Harris's or the others, their discussion on this doesn't actually come up with solutions for gender equality. So then that leads you to wonder if that's what they care about. And if they don't care about it, then that's a whole other question. I think for some, especially within the atheist community, the fact that feminism has been getting a lot wrong when it comes to Islam, a lot of people use that to all of a sudden mean that feminism can be disregarded, which is really strange to me, because those are not. It's using a similar tactic that they claim SJWs do, the identity politics or whatever. So the Women's March, I heard the majority of the criticism of it was, oh wait, but Linda Sarsour is still there, and it's like, well. You see all of the millions of women marching around the world. Do you think any of them even know who she is? Feminism isn't these 2 or 3 women that they talk about. And even those women, have you had a debate with them about their ideals? And it's so much more complex, and they've painted it as simple and finished. And a lot of people have taken that as truth, and they are ready to move on. And I don't know where else you would go other than towards gender equality. I mean, otherwise you're just going backwards, which is very sad.
Yeah, and the thing that I think is ironic about that is you've hit a point of saying, they're allowing someone like Linda Sarsour to basically define what an entire thing is. It reminds me very much of when fundamentalist Christians will often define all of atheism by somebody like Richard Dawkins. It's the same thinking, and it's not true. There's a wide diversity of opinion. That's the thing I love about doing my show, is that I'm interested in having conversations with people who I agree with, who I disagree with, who I'm genuinely interested in having different points of view. A couple episodes before you, I had somebody on who is a bit more critical of SJW stuff than, say, you or I are. I think that's valuable. I think that's a part of having a marketplace of ideas. But it's all about having the discussion, and that's what I think is very much relevant. The other thing I think I would point out, too, is that as I said earlier, there's a long heritage within sort of broadly the secular space of people who are feminists, people who are sort of people who would advocate for social justice and equality and things like that. I think those are all valuable, and I think it's important to have criticisms when you do. With that in mind, I think the last thing I'd like to ask you about before we finish up is, you mentioned identity politics, and I read the guy that Sam Harris had on his podcast a while back, Mark Lilla, who wrote the book The Once and Future Liberal, which is sort of a liberal critique of identity politics. I read that book, and there's a lot about it that I agree with, a lot I disagreed with. But I've made a point on my show before that I think it's important for us as liberals to make a point of saying, okay, identity politics aren't the end of the world. They keep being sort of prodded out as being the end of the world. And I used to hold that position. What I think is important is to have sort of a hierarchy of value in regard to how you look at this. So I think identity politics have their place, but they shouldn't have us neglect some of the bigger issues regarding inequality, or issues regarding institutional problems, whether it's issues involving law enforcement or issues involving the huge disparities in wealth between the 1% and everybody else, and talking about sort of the larger, big scale, sort of broader issues that unite people. And one politician who I think did this very, very well, that balance between sort of the politics of identity and the celebration of diversity and identity with these sort of bigger, broader goals of economic fairness and things like that, is Barack Obama. And that's why he was so successful, was because he did just that. And in some respects, I think he was able to do that because he was an African American. It's a lot harder for people like me as a white man. It's a lot harder for me to sort of do that. When you're an African American and you are sort of straddling that line in some ways, you had to sort of straddle two worlds. You get a lot better at being able to sort of find universal themes that tie people together. With that in mind, I would just love to get what your take is on the whole identity politics thing. Do you think it's bad? Do you think it's good? Or do you think it's somewhere in between?
Yeah, I think I'm still used to the term being considered a bad thing. So even as you're saying it, I'm like, oh, wait, identity politics is, a harm to democracy, right? But when I actually get down to it, I've been thinking about this a lot, sort of the individual expertness or the expertise that we can gain from our experience. And a lot of that experience comes from our demographic. So one of the things that bugs me and that I don't want to give up is the immediate victimhood. I don't want that to take place so much so that you're getting compensation for something that you weren't a victim of. But having said that, I think it's also important to understand that sometimes we can make statistical or broad assumptions that specific groups of people have experienced suffering or greater challenges, and thereby give them either a wider door to get into, or at least think, okay, they probably have some good expertise in this area. I think for America having such a large percentage of its population being non-white and having only one president non-white, that doesn't, from a statistical point of view, that doesn't necessarily strike me as representing the experience of America very well. That's where identity politics works. So when we say we want more women in films, it's because we just want our films to be more realistic. We want a better representation of all of humanity. That's the point of our art and our politics and our government and our business. All of it is an expression of our humanity. And if our humanity is only represented by a few white guys, then we don't feel a part of it. And not feeling a part of it, is a great sense of our loneliness. So I think that's where I see identity politics working. When you say, I'm speaking about the issues of white men, and you give the floor to a white man to explain those issues, I think that's all right to do. I think that's valid. It does make me kind of upset sometimes because I get a lot of times, the joke where people say, "Ugh, white people."
Oh yeah.
That's always bugged my boyfriend and I because he's an immigrant himself. He grew up he's Ukrainian Jewish from Israel, and I grew up in the Amazon jungle. So we don't feel like that's a fair, we don't feel North American. So sometimes when identity politics gets us wrong, when we're put in the wrong group, we feel really mad and we feel the stereotype is wrong. But I can also understand, okay, well I get it. It's just based on the probability and the statistics of how many blonde white girls. I assume you would expect me to know what they serve at Starbucks. I don't know what they serve, but I get why you think I would, and that's okay. I can give you the space for that, and I don't have to immediately say, reverse racism. So I think that's where we have to understand that identity politics makes us uncomfortable because we're afraid of being either left behind or gotten wrong. But that's the privilege of us who have been included for so long. And I think as we include other cultures and other identities, we are going to feel more, we're going to learn more about culture itself. And I think that that's really going to broaden all of our experiences with each other and make for a more welcoming world.
Yeah, I think that's true. I guess my general overall take of identity politics is that I think that one of the ways in which I think it's very good is what you've described, which is the expansion of perspectives and how perspectives allow us to create hopefully better policy and better choices about how we do things. I guess the one way in which I think it could be complemented in our culture is that democracies succeed with universal principles. I'm a huge fan of FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. And in the early parts of 1941, he gave a speech called the Four Freedoms speech. And the four freedoms are freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And he sort of defines them as the broad freedoms that we should fight for as sort of a universal human culture. And I agree with that. I think that one of the things that's important is I think that identity politics are using our identity as a means by which to understand politics or understand our way in the world is a component to that. But I think it's also important for us to maintain a sense of sort of broader values that we all sort of try to seek, whether it's equality or fairness or justice or freedom, things like that. I think those are equally important, and championing those while at the same time celebrating the diversity of viewpoints is a better way forward. I think that the position on this is somewhere a little in the middle, and not a faux middle like some people like to say, but I think a genuine space where we can have a more nuanced conversation. Because I think the problem with our culture these days is everything tends to fall into very tribal factions, and they expect if you're going to toe the line on one particular issue, that means you have to say the right things on all these other issues, and you have to be like, it's like a constant litmus test. And I think that sort of degrades critical inquiry, and it degrades, I think, meaningful discussion in a democracy. And so yeah, that's kind of my take. I just think that different perspectives are great, but I also think it's important that we sort of share some universal values within a democracy, because then we can truly be what, at least in the United States, what is our national motto. It's not "In God We Trust." That's not our motto at all. That was coined in the 50s to fight the godless communists. Our real motto is "E pluribus unum," out of many, one. And to me, that's the principle that we should always sort of go with, which is the out of many. That's the politics of identity into one, which is the idea of universal shared norms of democracy. So that's kind of my take on identity politics. And I think it's much harder to get it's not simple. And I think the value of conversations like this is that it allows us to sort of unpack some of these terms and get to the heart of what we think is important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I've thought a lot about that universal set of morals. I've thought about making a GitHub forum where we could all vote on a set and eventually come out with a couple that are universally applied. I think, yes, that is something that is the duty of feminists. That is the duty of all of us within the progressive community, is to find those values, those qualifications for the job. That's something that is fundamental, and I don't neglect that just because I love diversity.
That's great. That's great. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for an amazing conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed having you on the show. Where can people find your work?
Yes, thank you, Justin. This has been great. My work right now is mainly on sarahnicholson.co. That's Sarah with an H. And you can find the majority of my political commentaries with my mother's podcast, which is Women Beyond Belief podcast. She runs it with Karen Garst in combination with that book. And I'm hoping to start my own podcast soon, talking about science engineering and with a little section called Is That Sexist? So sort of fit that in there.
That's fantastic. That sounds great. Well, again, thank you so much for being on the show. As always, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Tumblr at The Daily Clark. You can follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/Reason Revolution. We're almost to 1,000 likes, so we're so close. You can check out our website, reasonrevolution.org. All of the episodes of the podcast, articles, blogs, everything is there. You can also hit the support tab. Your support is very generously appreciated, and definitely consider becoming a member at reasonrevolution.org. For $2 a month or a little more, you can get all kinds of special goodies we're going to be launching over the year. And of course, you can find us on SoundCloud, iTunes, YouTube, and Google Play. And until next week, this has been Justin Clark, and this has been Reason Revolution.